Welcome everybody to the Family Enterprise Exchange webinar. I'm Russell Baskin, the National Director of Education and Programming, and I want to welcome you today to our webinar, Succession in the Business Family, a behavioral solution to a behavioral problem. We have three fantastic presenters today. That will be Susan Latremoy, Andrew Pigott, and Paul Frederick. And I'm going to pass you over to Susan, who's going to make the introductions and lead you through today's presentation. Before we start, I just want to remind you that we will have time at the end of the webinar for questions, Q&A, and you'll see a box that will pop up in the lower right-hand corner where you can type in your questions, and Susan will moderate those and they will respond to as many as we have time for. But now I'm going to pass you over to Susan Latremoy.
Thanks, Russell, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our webinar, Succession in the Business Family, a behavioral solution to a behavioral problem. We have three main objectives that we'd like to cover today. The first is to help families and advisors understand the behavioral traits of family members and how such knowledge can assist in successful planning. Secondly, we want to identify the source of the most vexing problems that arise in family business succession planning. And thirdly, we want to offer you tools that can help founders and next-gen family members to overcome obstacles and hurdles. Before we get on with the session, though, I'd like to introduce the three of us in a little bit more detail. As Russell mentioned, my name is Susan Latremoy. I'm a wealth advisor with Richardson GMP, and I help people manage their financial futures and their wealth. I graduated from the FEA program, the Family Enterprise Advisor program, in 2017 and became very interested in helping families through a multi-generational approach to solve family business succession issues. Specifically, I like to work with founders who are moving from retirement to rewirement and also assess next generation members for suitability to take over the family business. This work led me to become a certified Success Finder practitioner and to collaborate with Andrew and Paul on this webinar project. Next is Andrew Pigott, who is the founder of Succession Bridge and the former president and director of CAFE, the Canadian Association of Family Enterprise, now called FEX, or Family Enterprise Exchange. Andrew is a member of a fourth-generation family business, which offers him a unique perspective on succession. He has skills in business valuation, corporate strategy, negotiation, facilitation, and corporate governance. Andrew's advisory approach is designed to help business families establish a forum of dialogue with the objective of achieving alignment on their vision, values, and expectations about the future. Also joining us today is Paul Frederick. Paul is CEO of Frederick & Associates. They are organizational performance consultants. Paul has many years' experience in executive and management assessment and coaching executive teams in strategy execution. Paul is a certified Success Finder practitioner, which is a highly advanced career and performance predictor assessment tool. Paul has worked in many sectors, including manufacturing, healthcare, private equity, wealth management, financial services, travel, engineering, and telecommunications, and has held senior global HR executive positions. Paul has innovated and applied a holistic business transformation process for achieving sustainable profit by focusing on the alignment of strategy, process, people, technology, and communications. So we are your presenters for today's webinar. When it comes to succession and transition, we've all been aware that there's a huge struggle taking place. So we'd like to examine some of the reasons why it is difficult for founders, matriarchs, and patriarchs to step away from the family business. Number one, the fear of losing control. You've been in the driver's seat for many, many years, and now it's time to pass the reins, and there's fear associated with losing control. Secondly, is lacking a future life purpose, not really knowing what's next for you and how to make that move. Third could be the lack of confidence in the next generation's abilities. Fourth is a focus on treating family members equally versus fairly. And fifth, lack of objectivity in assessing talent to ensure a right match. So we feel there are many struggles involved with succession and transition, and these are some of the factors associated with it. So why do traditional approaches to succession fail? Oftentimes decisions are made on birth order. It's often assumed that the firstborn will be the leader. There can also be gender bias. For example, oldest son is more capable than next in line or even oldest daughter. So a gender bias that maybe traditionally has favored men. There may be assumptions about next gen's capabilities and their education. Perhaps oldest son has now an engineering degree and an MBA, and therefore it is assumed after that that he is the most suitable to take over. There's also nepotism or favoritism, which could be a factor rather than just saying who is the best person from a behavioral standpoint to take over the leadership position. So a number of traditional approaches do fail, and we're here to explore some better ways to do things. I'm going to turn things now over to my colleague, Andrew Pigott, who will share his experience and research on this subject. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Susan. It's certainly my pleasure to be here today as we examine some of the behavioral problems that arise in business family succession situations. So let's start with some statistics. After all, who doesn't enjoy statistics? So consider the landmark study by the Williams Group. They're a US-based family consultancy that undertook a study of clients and outside families that transitioned their wealth, and they presented their findings in a book called Preparing Heirs. 3,250 different families partook in the study. And for purposes of the study, wealth was defined as business assets, real property, financial assets, personal assets, so a much broader scope than just the family business, if you will. And for the study, they also defined a successful transition as one where the wealth remained under the control of the beneficiaries. So again, it wasn't about the business per se, but more about the wealth that was under the control of the family. So if the family business were sold and converted to some other form of value, that's a reformatting of wealth. It's not necessarily a measure of success or failure. So using these definitions, Williams Group found that 70% of the 3,250 US families actually experienced failure in their transition. So let's take a closer look at what's behind that. First of all, failure. Let's talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the study that Williams Group undertook. The definition that they used was unsuccessful transition is one where there was an involuntary loss of family assets under the beneficiary due to bad investments, mismanagement, incompetence, family feud, or any other cause that might be under the family's control. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. Again, they focused in on what aspects were under the family's control. So not satisfied just with their own study, they looked more broadly at studies all over the place, and including studies by MIT and The Economist, which also came up and cited this 70% failure rate as really a worldwide phenomenon that really transcended country borders, tax laws, types of economies. It really didn't matter. But the one interesting thing, and the thing that really perplexed them, was that none of these studies really looked into the underlying causes of this high failure rate. So to begin, I think it's worth acknowledging that only 3%, a very small fraction of those failures, were due to bad financial, tax, or legal advice. And again, they commended the professional advisors that are out there in the market as having come of age and being highly proficient at what they do. But it obviously leaves the question of what explains the other 97%. So let's zero in a little bit. So there are key missing ingredients that they found in their survey of the 3,250 families. The first being trust and communication, and they attributed 60% of the failures due to a breakdown in these elements. And this happens Just to be clear, when family members can't rely on each other, or when they don't do what they promise, or where there's a lack of competence on behalf of the beneficiaries and the people taking over. 25% of the failures are due to inadequate preparation of errors. And I think we're going to move into a discussion of preparation and assessment a little bit later in this presentation. But preparation of errors has a lot to do, again, with communication itself. 10% were due to lack of a clear and agreed family vision, which would certainly serve to guide decisions and provide a critical reference framework for all the major issues that a family might encounter in its journey. So in essence, the failed transitions really relate back to the behavioral aspects of family relations. So when you boil all the stats down to their essence, it's fair to conclude that families need to prepare for transition by preparing their future leaders and ensuring that those behavioral competencies are in fact in place. So with that, I think I'll now hand things over to Paul, who will share his experience in assessing for behavioral leadership styles.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, good day. I'd like to give just a high-level overview of the assessment tools that are available in the marketplace, and they are very numerous. They can be broken into two major categories: personality assessments and also behavioral-based assessments. And there are significant differences between those two types of assessments. The personality assessment attempts to measure a broad range of basic traits. Some of you may be aware that many of these personality assessment tools are built around a academic theory or model, and the one most known is the DISC project, and it measures 4 basic traits. They do have value in terms of what they're used for. For example, in sales, you'll find a quadrant where they have personality assessments done on salespeople, and they get allocated to one of 4 components. There's harvester, there's the hunter, and et cetera. They get put into broad categories. And again, that is useful to understand what that personality profile is for these types of professions, et cetera. Their primary use, though, have primarily been to again, some self-awareness for the individual involved, but they're very much used in support of training and development that is provided for personality skilling. There has been a great deal of research by the psychological community, and these articles are available if anyone has interest in them. Has consistently proven that personality measures do little to predict well a person or how a person will perform on the job. And the prerequisites of education and knowledge are important, but at the end of the day, it's very important. What is that behavioral performance they use to apply that learning that they have? And again, the other findings that come, the personality tests are simply too broad to predict on-the-job performance. On behavioral-based assessments, and they are performance assessments, they narrow down, but they take a far greater review of a number of behavioral traits that are essential for high performance. And the key outcome that comes with that is that these instruments are able to predict performance against any number of career themes and benchmark positions, and very importantly, can be used for key decision-making on selection of people, the promotion of people, in session planning and development, identifying the high potential people, and preparing them through proper development in behavioral performance competencies to be available and ready to assume a greater level of responsibility. Just to elaborate a little bit on that, there's been studies by Harvard review on the assessments. Basically, these are really personality assessments. They're not accurate enough, not deep enough, not powerful enough, and not broad enough. And ultimately, they don't reliably predict a person's true potential success in a given role. It's not only a role, but it's also the career that they choose to pursue. Our preferred choice of assessment tool is Success Finder. The assessment measures 85 behavioral traits. The research that has gone behind Success Finder, it's been 4.5 decades, but in the early 30 or the first 30 years, we did extensive longitudinal research to the point where we were able to clearly identify with a high degree of accuracy and predict the successful performance of an individual, and particularly in specific careers and career themes. We also have 29 leadership competencies, and they're made up of a very specific set of traits, and they're aligned with the various career themes and benchmark positions that we have in within the Success Finder product. And again, just below that, there's 35 career themes, 2,500 benchmarks that predicts the outcome of success. It's used for generations, all generations, ages, stages of career. It also has been validated as gender neutral as well. It's the only assessment tool accredited for high-risk decision-making. Predictive accuracy is 85%. That may sound boastful on our part, but the American Psychological Association, they monitor the assessment tools in the marketplace, and they do have 4 categories that they allocate the various assessment tools, both the personality and the behavioral. And Success Finder is only one of 2 that has a category 1 rating, which is 85% plus. Again, that if you go to the American Psychological Association, you can see and find some of that information. And I think very importantly here, and I've done thousands of these, and that includes working with families and family members and extended family members, it very much confirms the gut instincts. We have, quite often when I'm talking, I did it myself, and I still do to some extent. You go with your gut instinct, and but certainly Success Finder will validate that that what you feel is the right decision. I'm going to share with you the benchmark for an owner, president, and CEO of a family business. And we're looking at the high performance behavioral preferences for that consistently high performance. This benchmark is a global benchmark. It's made up of families both in Canada and the United States. It includes Russia, parts of Europe. It also includes Asia, China in particular, India in that case. And we've done Switzerland. And my point is it's a number of companies, again, and it does come in as a global benchmark position. So what I'm going to share with you right now are the key components for the owner president of the family business. And by the categories, I mean, the first thing we look at is the career fit, and that's in the center of this hub and spoke. And there's 2 major career themes that are important: is how do they assess against management, and how do they assess against self-employment. Those are the 2 key career fit out of the 35 that are critical for successful leadership of a family-run business. The other components that we look at, and this is where we take all the 85 traits and they're allocated to 1 or more of these components. And we then look at what are the critical behavioral traits for performance. So we cover up, just going around the wheel, going from right to left, you've got problem solving, self-assessment, and for example, in self-assessment, self-expression is very key to achieving high performance and sustaining that. And by self-expression, we're talking about that ability to articulate, communicate both orally and in writing whatever goals or objectives or information you wish to communicate to various people. We then go down to coping strategies, and the key one within there is the work ethic, sometimes called workaholism. We then move down to work habits, and the key ones in there, there's about five in particular, but the efficiency and the decisiveness are the very key. The efficiency is it's that individual that can do probably 2 to 3 times more work in a given day than most other people. They're well organized, they're very decisive, which leads to the decisiveness, and they're very confident in their decision making as well. Again, I'm not going to go through every one of these circles, but I know you have these screens. The other one I'd like to point out is the motivational factor. Again, is very critical for sustaining and achieving and sustaining high performance. And you can see in there the industriousness, the stamina, initiative, and risk-taking. And I would also, one comment on problem solving, we talked about intuition and innovation. And in that area, we're talking creative problem solving to any number of issues that a president and CEO of a family-run business or any businesses really have to deal with. And it's a transition as you move up the executive ladder, if you wish, at say the director manager and the vice president levels. They're still looking pretty heavily at the analytical problem-solving approach, but there is that subtle shift from that analytical approach to really, again, where one's intuition and innovation becomes very important. So those are the key components that we review, and the 85 traits, again, that we talk about are allocated appropriately within the benchmark position, in this case, president and CEO. The next component is, these are the leadership competencies, again, for president and CEOs, again, to achieve and sustain these competencies. I've given you the basic definition here, but there's a couple I'd like to highlight that are very important to achieving that high performance and continuing to have success. And the one I want to talk about, there's 2 fundamental competencies in this grouping here. And the one thrives achievement. And the other one, it's on the next slide coming, is leads decisively. Those are the fundamental competencies at any management level that they have to, the foundation they have to be extremely competent in order to continue to advance. And thrives a chaos. The specific traits that we look at there are efficiency, structure, relaxation, and visibility. The traits that do make that one up. And then on the next 3 areas I want to talk about is under the relationship, inspires others. That's the ability to influence and persuade people, to create motivation of people, to agree to the ownership or the leadership of the president and CEO, the strategy that they've developed and implemented, and getting everybody on board and to be motivated to drive for achievement and sustain that achievement as well. The focus on results is the next one I would refer to under motivation. That focus on result is very important, and it's very important that when you're driving a business, you could be in a maintenance mode, you've got things up and running and going, but in these days, with all the disruption and changes in technology and everything, there's a greater need for the strategy to continue to evolve and evolve relatively rapidly. And during these periods of time, it really, again, for presidents and CEOs, and it's not just them, it's really all their people that are working for them too, they have to put a greater degree of effort in their time and go for it. It's not a permanent situation, but it's that commitment to put in the extra hours, if you wish, and to drive through and make sure that they continue to achieve and be successful. And then finally is the leads decisively. That again is being decisive and being confident in those decisions and not hesitate to make decisions. What they're very skilled at as well is they do understand risk management. They will probably have analyzed risk associated with their decisions and know what the intervention is to deal with any of these risks if they do occur. And again, it's not just the president. Part of their role is that leadership. There are people that are working for them and involved will be looking at that very effectively. So those are the key traits and the core components that we look at, problem solving, et cetera. And these, again, are the key leadership competencies for sustaining and achieving high performance. Just a note, I have worked with a number of families and in a number of corporations, et cetera, and all of it. I really want to address with the family. I can sort of claim I came out of a family business as a young lad. We had a general store in Grand Bend, Ontario, for those on Lake Huron, and so I was put into the business pretty early. One thing I learned from that is credit management is very important. But what I do, in my experience in working with the families that I do work, when you have the owner of the business, the spouse could very well be involved in the business as well, along with their children. There could very well be extended members involved in the business as well. And this whole issue of deciding, do the children want to be in the business? And if they do, great, and we can identify what are the best options available for them career-wise and success-wise to be allocated. And those that do not want to pursue and be involved in the business, we can still produce what would be their major career thrust and opportunities to move forward. And I really come at this from the impact it has on them, because we're bringing through information that they can truly make decisions on. And that information will resonate with them because we know what their behavioral DNA is. And when I go, for example, through these assessment reports with the people involved, there's a high degree of agreement. Yeah, you've got me, and I really do value this information. I think of the companies that again, the family businesses I've worked with in sorting out the respective roles, there's a great emotional release. There's respect for one another because there's clarity to where their expertise and competences are, and we're not guessing what are the respective roles of all the team members. And those are just a few of the I find very important steps forward for these companies. Some of the companies, organizations I've worked with have been, some of them have been in their 5th, 6th generation. Others, more typically, are they're in their 2nd, moving into the 3rd generation is where I've been involved with. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Paul. Some very powerful ideas there on assessments and how they're used. So because the focus of today is on the behavioral challenges facing the business family, I thought I'd take a bit of time just to create some context before I move through and into my own family business story. So here we have family business, a fine balance. This is a diagram that is from the book Strategic Planning for the Family Business by Carlock and Ward, a great read, and it presents what they call the family business dilemma. And I think that, like the Williams Group, Carlock and Ward acknowledge that very often the family itself becomes the stumbling block to long-term success, because it's the friction that arises between loved ones and business interests that makes family business unique, but it also is what creates sometimes choppy waters. So to balance family demands with business demands calls for plans and policies around the 5 pivotal variables that are listed in the triangle. And I'll just spend a moment on them. Again, they pertain a great deal to how family members behave towards each other. First is control, which is all about establishing a fair way to make decisions within the family, in the management of the business, and ultimately in the ownership. And there are careers. How do you make possible careers in the family business for those who are suited to it? And how do you govern advancement for those individuals? There's capital. And those are the agreements that family needs so that they can reinvest in the business at the appropriate time, or also be able to sell an interest and to not damage either the business or the family in the process. And there's conflict. And being able to address conflicts that arise due to the intersection of work and personal lives within the family. And finally, there's culture, using family values to inform plans and actions going forward, which I think is a hugely powerful thing that can be used to the benefit of the family. So each of these elements amount to really rules around behavior from my standpoint. And so I'm now going to touch upon my family story and how we ultimately over time lost our balance. So established in 1875, Pigott became a leading Canadian construction company. This story is intended to draw attention to some of the behavioral challenges that our family had to grapple with over its 100+ years in existence. I'll note that I joined the family company in 1986. I'll note that I joined the family company in 1986, so I was witness to some of the challenges that emerged during the final chapter of our company. And much of what I will share is based not on something I've made up, but it really comes down to the diaries, extensive diaries kept by my grandfather, Joseph M. Pigott, who led the business during its second generation. And he was the one who built and developed the structure you see there. That's the Pigott Building in Hamilton, which opened just in time for the Great Depression. And it was just one of many close calls that he had over quite a colorful career. So we'll start in generation one. And that's my great-grandfather, Michael Pigott, who was an Irish immigrant, who was a carpenter by trade. And he took his carpentry business and morphed it into something much more substantial. You'll see some of the projects that were built by him in the Hamilton City Hall, Galt Post Office. Those were built in the 1880s, and the project on the left being the sod turning of the Minnesätung Bridge project near Goderich, which landed Michael in a major lawsuit against the CP Rail, which was never a great idea to take on someone of that size. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the project essentially bankrupted him financially and emotionally. And it was a key pivot point for him. And that's really where I believe generation one ended and generation two began. So again, 1903, Michael Pigott, who had two sons, Roy, who was the younger, and my grandfather, Joe, were quite young in 1903, which at the time of the troubles with the bridge, Michael suffered a rather severe attack, and doctors said he had mere months to live. So on the advice of the doctors, his oldest son, Joseph, my grandfather, was told to quit school, learn his father's affairs, and essentially take over the business at the age of 18. So grandfather Joseph stepped in and was later joined by his younger brother, Roy, who was a graduate engineer. And by all accounts, Joe did very well in steering the company forward in his father's absence. But the fact of the matter is his father lasted a lot more than 6 months. In fact, he lived another 13 years, which sounds like a feel-good story, but in fact, my grandfather's diaries paint the picture of a very difficult relationship between father and son. Again, I don't think they came to peace until much later about who would run the business and control it. So I think there was a real power struggle in any case at this, for many years until my great-grandfather passed away. In any case, after my great-grandfather did pass, Joe went on to lead the company and built many, many iconic structures, some of which are pictured here, the Royal Ontario Museum on Avenue Road being one of them you might recognize. So from there we move to generation three. This is where the real crux of the story begins. That's my grandfather, Joseph, who lived until 1969. And he had 6 sons, 4 of whom pursued careers in the construction business. The oldest was my father, Bill, who is on the far left. He stayed back during the war to work in the business. And his other brothers, Jock and Joe, were served in the war and came back as decorated servicemen. The company had tremendous success during the 40s and 50s. That's the youngest brother, Paul Pigott, there. So as the oldest, my father, Bill, was destined to take over the leadership of the company. Susan touched upon that earlier. Right or wrong, he was the guy who was touched to take over the company, and he was appointed president in 1957. But my grandfather's diaries certainly indicate that this appointment was not necessarily embraced. And an entry from my grandfather's diaries in 1957, the year of my father's ascension as president, read as follows: "Real trouble. As long as I am head man, call me what you like. There'll be no real takeover by Bill. And why don't I get out of the way? The real answer, I'm not sure, but things may soon fall apart after I quit." So until 1969, my grandfather served as the steadying hand that kept things, I think, under control. He managed his sons, kept them together as the best he could, but I think that there were cracks in the hull, that the culture of the company began to suffer as a result of these internal conflicts. They still were outstanding builders throughout that time, builders and engineers, and they undertook many ambitious projects. Toronto Dominion Centre there in the late 60s and early 70s among one of their more sizable undertakings. So what happened, to boil it all down? So we were unable to navigate to the fourth generation. I would have been part of the fourth generation, and what elements might have been missing. So I think the success of the company in the 40s and 50s reinforced the structure that was in place. It made it difficult for my grandfather to step away and truly pass authority on to his sons. And just as it was predicted by Carlock and Ward, the family itself became the long-term stumbling block to success. It wasn't for lack of skills and abilities in construction itself. It was a traditional hierarchy, and was it a predictable result? Well, I think, as often happens in my consultancy with business families, sometimes they're not aware, not self-aware. They don't know really what they don't know, and that can sometimes get you into trouble. And I think that over time, my father and his brothers became more disengaged. They really didn't have the tools and resources that I think we now have as a business family industry to help navigate through these situations. So I think that, unfortunately, boundaries came up, communications were compromised, and there was a hindrance in terms of sharing thoughts, ideas, and ambitions. And they really didn't know how to resolve the conflicts that inevitably arose around career, capital, who controlled the business, and so forth. And in fact, how to embrace the company culture and to use it as the steering mechanism to take the company into future generations of family ownership. So what happened? Once my grandfather Joseph was gone, there was again, authority challenge within the four siblings. The focus shifted. My uncles wanted to get into real estate development, which is much different than construction. So there really wasn't a shared set of goals around the family legacy. And as a result, the company ultimately was weakened as two of the brothers attempted to exit the business and ultimately did. But it was a costly distraction. And I think that really brings me back to, I think, a really critical element, fair process, which really gets back to how family members behave around and towards each other. And I think some of the tools that Paul has talked about can be extremely informative in terms of fair process, which really involves engaging the family in discussions on issues, plans, and decisions, and being very clear on those matters, and explaining those things, letting family members, both in the business and outside the business, know the rationale for decisions. And finally, when you bring engagement and explanation together, you can create and manage the expectations about career and ownership possibilities. And so I would say that our family was not particularly competent at applying the principles of fair process. Probably wasn't a term that existed back then, to be entirely fair. So the behavioral problems that are part and parcel of family really, again, I think, as the Williams Group had found, were really the underlying factor that spelled the sort of the end of a three-generation family company. So again, I think ultimately the inability to manage expectations of the family and to control and manage behaviors, more importantly, were ultimately what eroded the cohesion that was so evident certainly while my grandfather was alive. So I'm going to turn this over for the summary.
Thank you. So just before we open the lines and open the Q&A session, I just have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to Andrew and Paul, but feel free now to start to queue up your questions, as we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A for the panel. So my first question is directed at Andrew. How would things have been different, Andrew, if you if your family had access to assessment tools when they were going through some of these issues? How would things have been different, do you think?
I think what assessment tools do, and it doesn't have to be just assessment tools, but I think one of the challenges we encountered as a family was we became quite inwardly focused. We really didn't reach out for the advice around some of the behavioral matters that we could have. I think to have had the dialogue built up around something like the assessments that Paul has described would be a great way to begin a dialogue, a discussion around very touchy subjects. My father, I don't know, was he the right person to be the president and run the business? I'm sure his brothers would have their own case to make about that decision. So I think that it would help to allay, and it would help to get the issues out on the table that otherwise really lie in the bushes and can ultimately end up causing much larger problems than the dialogue that exists as a result of diving in.
And turning to Paul, you've made a strong case for why assessments are so critical to predicting really performance of future leaders. But we don't see a lot of people using them, and I'm curious to know what holds people back from engaging in an assessment activity when they're making these major decisions.
I think there's a number of reasons. First of all, generally in the community, the business community, I'll talk more specifically about it, and also in the educational field. Now, the knowledge of assessment tools is very low, and the actual usage of them is quite low as well too. And some of the ones that they do use, they just aren't providing the level of information necessary that's provided. I think one of the other parts is to realize that the investment in making the use of, and I'll be more specific to the behavioral-based assessment tools, which can be used for decision making. I'm always somewhat amazed at times as to why, for such critical decisions that need to be made, that they would rather go with their gut instincts. Let me describe it that way. And again, some of those gut instincts are very important, but the investment is not that significant for the return on it, and the return on it, in particular, helping the members of the family to know what their respective role could be within the organization, how to work effectively together as a team. And for those that do not want to continue within the business at a point in time, we can help them very clearly decide what career options and such that they would like to exercise. And but again, it's I'm seeing an increase in the use of the assessment tool now, particularly with the younger generations coming right now. They're somewhat confused as to what is it I need to be doing, and I think it's really for those reasons. And frankly, the marketplace, people in the businesses of assessments have done a very poor job, I believe, in marketing to people such as yourselves and others the value of these tools, and they don't get a lot of attention. That is changing, and I think changing rapidly now at this point in time. But it's like any other investment you make in business. You're looking for a return on it, and the more advanced assessments, and again, that's why we choose the Success Finder, you can clearly see the impact of that investment on the performance overall of a family-run business. And again, for those that don't continue in the business, their success in their own life in terms of the career that they choose as well too. They will always keep engaged with the other the family as well, but they choose, etc. But think of it as an investment with very significant return on investment is the attitude we need to have.
Mm-hmm. So further to that, do you think that assessments should be used with spouses in a family business environment?
Absolutely. Whether they're directly involved in the business or partially engaged, But because of the spouses, they're going to be making decisions, and not only in the business, but the family unit as a whole. And yes, it's well worth their while to go through the investments. One of the things that we do look at in that context, we can take a family, and it's what we call a congruence study. And what we're looking at there is each of the members of the family, what are their profiles, what are their, how do they effectively communicate, their various competencies, and how do they blend as a member of the team, and what is the predictability of constructive contention, as we refer to as. And I think there's great value in that. Again, I've done that with any number of teams, executive teams and project teams, and also certainly within the family, the businesses as well too. But again, I think Andrew's point was very important, of that, those emotions and getting those issues out that are behaviorally oriented, getting those out, but with concrete information that can help resolve and bring immediate family, or the immediate family plus extended family members that may be involved in the business as well, and get the unity and overall commitment to drive forward in the interests, total interests of the business and the results that it provides to them.
Thank you, Paul. It looks like we have some questions from you participating in the webinar. So we have a question, first question's coming in from Logan. And Logan is asking the question, should we as advisors attempt to mediate or guide our families to potential solutions? Or is it wiser to find counselors and coaches that perhaps specialize in family communications and goal setting? So, do you have a view on that, Andrew?
I can share a few views on that, absolutely. So Logan, it depends, first off, what your role is to begin with. So sometimes advisors, depending on their role, whether they have the skills is one question, but in order to objectively and independently be able to wade into those waters, which can get very tricky, you have to look at how doing so yourself might impact the relationship with the client. So in my own situation, I will work with the families to facilitate understanding and agreement on particular issues. If there are deep-seated problems and challenges that go beyond my expertise, certainly don't hesitate to call in subject matter experts to take that on.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the question, Logan. We have a question from Nancy, and Nancy's asking, does seeing the conclusion of one's own behavioral preference assessment upset them if the result shows that they're not suited to be the leader? And how do you deal with that? Paul, can you take that one?
Yeah. I do mean this seriously and honestly to all that are participating. I've done thousands of these assessments, and because of the accuracy of the assessment, first of all, when the people complete the survey, I get that data, and I'm able to tell from the data, we process it, and we get what we call a self-disclosure score, and that's telling us that when the person completed the survey, we've really captured their true makeup around those 85 traits. And when I generate the reports and provide the briefing and consultation, what I observe is how well the report has captured them, because it resonates with them, because I'm really describing to them their makeup that they agree to. And we always look at things, we look at their strengths as a leader or in various professional roles and other types of roles. And we also look at their, again, those competencies that are required. And again, because we're reporting out based on their survey data, their leading strengths, etc. Again, it resonates quite well. I've never had anyone, and I do mean that seriously object to it. I think in some cases, yes, there are surprises that come to them, but when you talk them through the results and the reasons for the results, it will say, well, you know, that does make sense, because I've felt that before, or I thought about a certain career or certain competencies are my strength, or ones that I need to lead on. But it doesn't happen.
I would really agree with that. I know that when I went through my Success Finder assessment, it was a real validation of who I already knew I was. And if it hadn't shown that I was suited to a position, I would have really wanted to know that before I took the risk of taking on the role and being subject to failure. So I agree with you on that. Thank you, Nancy, for that question. Next question we have is from Pat. Again, I'll direct this one to Paul. What benchmarks can Success Finder typically assess against, and how do you establish these benchmarks?
Okay. We establish the benchmarks. We work with research that Dr. Larry Cash, the founder of Success Finders, been involved in directly, or other meta-analysis research that we have on behavioral preferences, etc. The other part is where we work with actual organizations. And in all those cases, we're establishing what is the performance criteria, the KPIs or performance objectives of that. We also ask them to assess their people in their organization on 3 to 4 levels of performance. And from that, we're able to extract from that who their high performers are and what is that trait makeup. And we do that by career themes, and we do it by respective benchmarks. On the benchmarks, I'll give you examples. In the management theme, we cover from board of directors, president, CEOs, the vice presidents, and we have 3 levels of vice presidents. We have manager, director, right down to a group leader. We have what we call the ladder of leadership, and that describes all those letters and the exact traits of performance that are required, along with the leadership competencies as well too. When I'm preparing people, I'm working on 2 right now where we're preparing 2 individuals to become presidents. They're at a senior executive level now. We know what their strengths and abilities are, and we know what the changes are going to be as they move to that higher level. So we do a gap analysis, then we provide the intervention that's necessary for success. In a given career line, if I take, for example, engineering, first of all, what we look at is how does a person score against the engineering profession itself? And again, we're looking at what we call the predictor performance. And then we have a stream of benchmark positions in engineering. It covers all the disciplines. It also includes engineering reliability, quality control, etc. And it also includes all the management levels as well for within the engineering families. And I can go on. There's a number of, again, there's 35 career themes. So again, within each of those career themes, there is a series of jobs of benchmark positions. And these become very important. They are progressive. They are kept current. We've updated our management recently. We've updated engineering. And what we're doing there is capturing the thousands of other assessments that have taken place over a period of time and bringing it more current. And that's where we are able to see some, in some cases, most of it is subtle shifts in some of the emphasis essential for performance. So this is a continuous process of capturing current trends that are going on in these various different roles.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Pat, for that question. We have time for one last question, which is really in 2 parts, again for Paul. Is Success Finder a self-assessment or a 360 tool? And how does Success Finder compare to such 360 assessment tools such as CCL's benchmarks and Lominger's voices?
In Success Finder, we do both. We do the assessments, but we have also our own 360 degree, and it's based around the leadership competencies. So we have that continuity. And again, that particular assessment tool is rated with a high degree of accuracy. I do know the other ones. I've actually used some of them in my corporate life in the earlier days, and they do have value, but this may sound more like a pitch to you, but I know factually that we can within the one survey that is done, we can do both 360s and the career assessments, etc.
Great. So I would just like to take a few minutes now to summarize the key points. And I think you can tell from the conversation in our presentation today that we believe that the behavioral dimension is a key consideration in business succession planning. And that really when you look at a person's behavioral preferences, there are some vital clues there as to how that person will perform in a given role. Using the behavioral-based assessment tools can also inform other disciplines as well. And as Paul pointed out, the accuracy is empirically based. We also believe that Success Finder takes away that subjectivity and adds objectivity to the important decisions. So next steps, if you are a family business and succession is in the cards for you, then to really look at and determine the state of succession in your family business. Where are you at? These things should be started many years before someone is actually going to leave the business or a new person from the family is going to enter the business. So we're big advocates of doing that assessment early on in a stage of the family business succession discussion. Next step, we would say to identify the blind spots and the potential issues associated with family business succession. We're advocates of using assessment tools to uncover these behaviors and to determine the competencies associated for each of the roles that someone would take on. And finally, I would say that the three of us are all available for further assistance. Certainly, you can see from the presentation today that Andrew has deep experience working not only in his family business, but as an advisor to business families through the Succession Bridge. Paul is really a master at assessment tools and specifically a very high-level Success Finder practitioner who has many, many years' experience working with people. My particular interest is in working with founders who are ready to move away but don't really have a plan for what they want to do next in their lives. So moving that transition from retirement to rewirement, not just going to the golf course or the beach, but actually thinking about how they can use that lifetime of experience and transform that into something that will be interesting and sustainable for them for the rest of their lives. So each one of us has kind of a different take on it, but each one of us has a passion for helping family businesses with this important area of business succession. So helping family businesses with this important area of business succession. So we invite you to contact us through Family Enterprise Exchange or directly if we can help you with any of these issues in your family business. So thank you to Paul and Andrew for being on our panel today, and to Russell, of course, from Family Enterprise Exchange for inviting us and coordinating this session. Thank you.
And I want to say thank you to Susan, to Andrew, and to Paul for a great presentation. This is the last webinar for 2018, but we will be back with a new schedule for 2019. And since this is the last time I'll see you on the web, I want to wish you happy holidays. I know it's a bit early, but there you go. And look forward to seeing you again in the new year. And thank you. One other thing, we are going to be sending out an evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. So please take the time to complete it. It just only takes a few minutes. Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.